Frank's hands trembled as he closed the manila folder marked October 2023 and slid it back into its designated slot on the metal shelving unit. The basement study felt colder tonight, despite the space heater humming in the corner. Above him, the old farmhouse creaked and settled, each groan of timber a reminder of how alone he was out here, except for the presence he knew was watching from the tree line. The grandfather clock in the living room chimed 11 times, its deep bronze notes filtering down through the floorboards. Frank checked his watch and felt his pulse quicken. Sarah's car would pull into his gravel driveway sometime tomorrow afternoon, armed with brochures for Sunset Manor and that patronizing smile she'd perfected during her years as a social worker. She'd made her intentions clear during their last phone call. "Dad, you're 74 and living like a hermit. It's time to be practical. Practical. As if anything about the last 5 decades of his life could be called practical. Frank pulled his wool cardigan tighter and climbed the narrow wooden stairs, each step announcing his presence to the forest beyond. In the kitchen, he poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon and walked to the back window. The October moon hung full and silver above the pine canopy, casting long shadows across the overgrown field that separated his property from the abandoned logging camp. Somewhere out there, among the skeletal remains of rusted machinery and collapsed barracks, the Guardian would be stirring. The ritual had become as predictable as sunrise. Every full moon for 50 years, the creature emerged from whatever deep hollow it called home and took its position at the forest's edge. Sometimes it stood motionless for hours, those amber eyes fixed on Frank's house with an intelligence that made his veterinarian's training feel woefully inadequate. Other times it paced along the invisible boundary that seemed to govern their relationship, never closer than 30 yards, never farther than the dying oak that marked the old property line. Frank had tried to break the pattern exactly once, in 1987. He'd approached to within 15 feet before the Guardian had released a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through his bones. The message had been unmistakable, this close and no closer. Frank had backed away slowly, and they'd returned to their careful dance of observation and respect. The elk carcass from last month still lay where the Guardian had left it, picked clean by scavengers but not moved. Frank had stopped trying to dispose of the gifts years ago. The creature seemed to prefer that they remain as markers, like waypoints in a language Frank couldn't quite decipher. His journals contained detailed sketches of each offering's placement, searching for patterns that might unlock the mystery of their relationship. Because that's what it was, Frank knew. Not just random encounters with some unknown species, but a relationship built on mutual recognition of something neither of them fully understood. The bourbon burned warm in his chest as he thought about tomorrow's confrontation with Sarah. How do you explain 5 decades of impossible encounters to a daughter who hasn't visited in 3 years? How do you describe the weight of carrying a secret that feels too big for one lifetime, too important to die with you but too unbelievable to share? Frank had tried once before, back in 1995 when Sarah was finishing college. He'd shown her a single photograph, one of his clearest shots of the Guardian's distinctive profile. She'd studied it with the clinical detachment she'd inherited from him, then suggested he might want to talk to someone about the isolation getting to him. The conversation had ended there, and Frank had never brought it up again. But now, with Sarah planning to pack him off to some sterile facility where his biggest excitement would be bingo night and Jell-O variations, Frank felt the urgency of unfinished business pressing against his chest. The Guardian wasn't just some woodland anomaly to be documented and filed away. It was connected to these woods, to this place, in ways that made Frank feel like an accidental custodian of something ancient and significant. Movement caught his eye through the kitchen window. There, at the edge of the tree line, a massive shadow detached itself from the darkness between 2 towering pines. Even at this distance, Frank could make out the creature's distinctive silhouette, broad shoulders tapering to a powerful torso, legs that seemed designed for both bipedal walking and 4-legged running. The Guardian had arrived right on schedule. Frank raised his glass in a subtle salute, knowing those amber eyes would catch the gesture. For a moment, the creature remained perfectly still. Then, in what Frank had learned to recognize as acknowledgement, The guardian lifted one enormous hand, not quite human, not quite paw, and held it steady for 3 heartbeats before melting back into the forest. Tomorrow, Sarah would arrive with her forms and her good intentions and her complete inability to understand what Frank was protecting. But tonight, the ancient ritual continued as it had for 50 years, and Frank allowed himself to believe that some truths were worth preserving, even if no one else was ready to hear them. Frank woke to weak October sunlight, filtering through curtains that hadn't been replaced since Margaret died. The same routine that had governed his mornings for the past 8 years pulled him from bed at 6:30 sharp, coffee first, then medication for his arthritis, followed by a walk around the property's perimeter to check for signs of the guardian's nighttime activities. The kitchen coffee maker gurgled to life, with the reliability of an old friend. Frank had learned to appreciate such predictability after losing his veterinary practice to retirement and his wife to cancer within the same devastating year. The house felt too big for one person, but it was the house where Margaret had hung her watercolors in the hallway, where they'd raised Sarah through her rebellious teenage years, where 50 years of field notes documented the impossible. Outside, his breath formed small clouds as he followed the worn path along the tree line. The guardian had left no new gifts, but Frank found fresh impressions in the soft earth near the dying oak, footprints that measured nearly 14 inches long, with claw marks that suggested something between a wolf's paw and a human hand. He photographed them with the same digital camera he'd been using for the past decade, adding them to the thousands of images stored in his basement archive. The loneliness hit hardest during these morning walks. Margaret used to worry about his obsession with the woods, but she'd never demanded explanations the way Sarah did. Frank's got his creatures, she'd tell visitors with affectionate resignation, the same tone she'd used when describing his habit of bringing home injured animals. She'd understood that some men collected stamps or restored classic cars, while her husband documented something that shouldn't exist. By 9 o'clock, Frank was back in his basement study, transcribing the previous night's encounter into his current journal. His handwriting had grown shakier over the years, but his observations remained precise. October 15th, 2023, full moon. Guardian appeared at 11:47 p.m., remained visible for approximately 8 minutes. Standard acknowledgement gesture observed. Weather clear, temperature 34 degrees Fahrenheit. The methodical documentation had become both anchor and burden. 50 years of careful notes created an undeniable record, but also an overwhelming sense of responsibility. What happens to 5 decades of impossible truth when the only witness dies? Frank had considered donating his research to universities, but imagined graduate students laughing at the old veterinarian's elaborate fantasy. The work felt too important for that kind of dismissal, too fragile for academic skepticism. His phone rang at 10:15, interrupting his morning ritual. Sarah's voice carried the forced cheerfulness of someone delivering unwelcome news. "Dad, I'm running a little early. I should be there around noon instead of this afternoon." Frank's stomach tightened. He'd planned to spend the extra hours organizing his thoughts, maybe selecting a few of his most convincing photographs to share with her. "That's fine, sweetheart. Drive carefully on the back roads." "I will. And Dad, I know this conversation isn't going to be easy, but I really think Sunset Manor could be good for you. They have activities other people your age to talk to. You've been isolated out there for too long." After hanging up, Frank climbed back upstairs and looked around the house with Sarah's eyes. He saw the accumulation of widower living, newspapers stacked on the coffee table, the same 3 coffee mugs rotating through the dishwasher, Margaret's reading chair gathering dust because he couldn't bear to sit in it. Sarah would see evidence of decline, proof that her father needed supervision and social interaction. But Frank also saw the view from the kitchen window that had framed 50 years of impossible encounters. He saw the basement door that led to his life's work, and the worn path to the tree line where something ancient and intelligent maintained its patient vigil. How do you explain that leaving this place would break a covenant older than civilization? The grandfather clock chimed 11:30, and Frank felt time accelerating toward an unwanted confrontation. He walked through the house one more time, noting details he'd taken for granted. The way afternoon light fell across Margaret's watercolor of the back meadow, the comfortable creak of floorboards worn smooth by decades of footsteps, the profound silence that came from living miles from the nearest neighbor. This was what he had to lose. Not just a house, but a sacred trust. Somewhere in these woods, the guardian was waiting for tonight's full moon, expecting Frank to be at his kitchen window as he had been for 5 decades. The creature had never failed to appear, and Frank had never failed to witness. It was a relationship built on mutual dependability, and Frank couldn't shake the feeling that breaking it would unleash consequences neither of them understood. At 11:45, he heard tires on gravel. Through the front window, he watched Sarah emerge from her silver sedan, her expression already shifting into professional social worker mode as she surveyed the property's isolation. She straightened her blazer and gathered a folder of papers, preparing to save her father from a life she couldn't begin to comprehend. Frank met her at the door, knowing this conversation would determine whether 50 years of impossible truth died with him, or found some way to survive what came next. "Hello, sweetheart." Frank opened the door before Sarah could knock, studying his daughter's face for signs of the little girl who used to beg him for bedtime stories about the animals he'd treated. At 42, Sarah had inherited Margaret's sharp cheekbones and his own stubborn jaw, but her eyes held the professional distance of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions for people who couldn't make them for themselves. "Dad!" Sarah's smile was warm but cautious as she stepped into the entryway, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors. She paused to take in the familiar surroundings, the coat rack that still held Margaret's winter jacket, the small table where keys and mail accumulated in careful piles, the faint smell of coffee and old wood that had permeated the house for decades. "You look good. Have you been eating enough?" "I'm fine, Sarah. Coffee?" "Please." She followed him into the kitchen, and Frank caught her quick assessment of the space. Clean dishes in the drainer, fresh coffee in the pot, no obvious signs of neglect. He knew she was looking for evidence to support her case, the way she'd been trained to evaluate elderly clients for their own safety. As Frank poured 2 mugs, Sarah settled at the kitchen table and opened her folder. "I brought some information about Sunset Manor. It's only 40 minutes from my house, so I could visit regularly. They have medical staff on site, group activities, even a small library." Frank set her coffee down and took his usual seat across from her, the same arrangement they'd used for countless conversations over the years. "Sarah, I need you to understand something about this place." "Dad, I know it's hard." Her voice carried the practiced empathy of someone who'd guided dozens of families through similar transitions. "This house has so many memories. But you're 74 and you're completely isolated out here. What if you fell? What if you had a medical emergency? Your nearest neighbor is 8 miles away." Through the kitchen window, Frank could see the tree line where the guardian would appear in less than 12 hours. "How do you explain to your daughter that you're not just a lonely old man, but the keeper of something extraordinary? There are things about this property that you don't understand. Responsibilities that I can't just abandon." Sarah's expression shifted into the gentle but firm tone she used with resistant clients. "Dad, I've been worried about you since Mom died. 8 years of living alone out here, barely any social contact. I think the isolation might be affecting your judgment more than you realize." The words hung between them like an accusation. Frank recognized the subtext. Sarah thought he was becoming delusional, that grief and solitude had compromised his mental faculties. The irony wasn't lost on him. The most significant relationship of the past 50 years was the one thing guaranteed to make her doubt his sanity. "What if I told you I had a very good reason for staying?" Frank studied his daughter's face, searching for any sign that she might be ready to hear an impossible truth. What if there was something here that needed protection? "Dad!" Sarah's voice carried the patient weariness of someone who'd had this conversation with countless elderly clients. "I know you feel connected to this place, but those feelings aren't more important than your safety and health. Sunset Manor has beautiful grounds, nature trails. You could still enjoy the outdoors without being so isolated." Frank felt the weight of 50 years pressing against his chest. Every full moon, every careful documentation, every moment of wonder and terror at knowing something that challenged everything science claimed to understand about the world. In 12 hours, the Guardian would emerge from the forest expecting to find Frank at his kitchen window. The thought of breaking that ancient rhythm filled him with dread. "Sarah, what if I showed you something that would change your mind about this place?" Something in his tone made her pause, coffee mug halfway to her lips. "What do you mean?" Frank stood up, knowing he was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. For 8 years since Margaret's death, he'd protected his secret alone. For 3 years since Sarah's last visit, he'd carried the burden of wondering what would happen to 50 years of impossible encounters when he was gone. Now, facing the prospect of being warehoused in a facility where his most exciting visitor would be a volunteer with a therapy dog, Frank made a choice that terrified him. "Come with me." He led her toward the basement door, his hand trembling slightly as it touched the handle. Behind this door lay his life's work, his impossible archive, his careful documentation of something that shouldn't exist. Sarah followed reluctantly, her folder of Sunset Manor brochures forgotten on the kitchen table. "Dad, what is this about?" Frank paused at the top of the basement stairs, knowing that whatever happened next would either save his secret or confirm his daughter's worst fears about his mental state. "I need to show you why I can't leave this place, why something depends on me staying here." He opened the door and began his descent into 5 decades of impossible truth. Frank stopped halfway down the basement stairs, his arthritic fingers gripping the wooden banister as doubt crashed over him like a physical force. The familiar musty smell of his underground sanctuary, decades of paper, old leather journal bindings, and the faint chemical tang of photographic chemicals suddenly felt suffocating rather than comforting. Behind him, Sarah's footsteps had paused. "Dad, are you okay?" He wasn't okay. In this moment, suspended between the normal world above and the impossible archive below, Frank felt the full weight of what he was about to do. For 50 years, he'd been the sole keeper of something that defied explanation. The Guardian's existence had been his burden, his wonder, his terrible and magnificent secret. Once he opened that door to another person, even his own daughter, everything would change. "Dad." Frank closed his eyes, remembering the last time he'd tried to share his secret. 1995. Sarah home from college, full of scientific certainty and rational skepticism. He'd shown her just one photograph then, a single blurry image that could have been dismissed as a hoax or misidentification. Her reaction had been kind but devastating, gentle suggestions about grief counseling, concerned questions about isolation, the unmistakable look of someone humoring a confused old man. That was 28 years ago, when Frank's documentation was far less comprehensive. Now, his basement contained thousands of photographs, detailed behavioral observations, audio recordings, plaster casts of footprints. Evidence that would either vindicate 50 years of careful work or serve as proof of the most elaborate delusion in psychiatric history. "I'm fine," he managed, though his voice sounded hollow in the narrow stairwell. "Just give me a moment." What if Sarah was right? The question that Frank had successfully suppressed for years suddenly demanded attention. What if 8 years of widower isolation had warped his perception? What if the grief of losing Margaret had finally broken something fundamental in his mind? Veterinarians were trained observers, but they were also human. They could make mistakes. They could see things that weren't there. The rational part of Frank's mind, the part that had diagnosed livestock diseases and recommended treatments based on scientific evidence, began cataloging possibilities. Shared psychotic disorder was rare but documented. Prolonged isolation could trigger hallucinations. Grief, combined with the disorientation of retirement and advancing age, might create elaborate fantasy structures that felt absolutely real to the person experiencing them. "Dad, maybe we should go back upstairs." Sarah's voice carried a new note of concern. "You're shaking." Frank looked down at his hands and saw she was right. The tremor he'd attributed to arthritis had intensified, spreading from his fingers to his entire body. Because if he was wrong, if 50 years of encounters were nothing more than the elaborate construction of a lonely, aging mind, then Sarah's assessment was completely accurate. He was a man who needed supervision, medical attention, possibly psychiatric intervention. But if he was right, the memory hit him with startling clarity. Last month's encounter, when the Guardian had appeared during an unexpected October thunderstorm, Frank had watched through the kitchen window as lightning illuminated the massive figure, standing motionless in the driving rain. The creature had remained perfectly still for over an hour, water streaming from its dark fur, amber eyes never leaving Frank's house. No hallucination would maintain that level of consistent detail, that sense of independent will and purpose. Frank thought about the elk carcasses, some weighing over 300 pounds, deposited at precise locations along the tree line. He thought about the footprint casts locked in his filing cabinet, each one measuring nearly 14 inches with distinctive claw patterns. He thought about the audio recordings, low, rumbling vocalizations that registered frequencies barely within human hearing range, physical evidence. That's what separated his encounters from delusion. Unless... Dad, I think we should call Dr. Hendricks. Sarah had moved closer, her social worker instincts fully engaged. This level of anxiety isn't normal. When was your last physical? The suggestion sent a spike of panic through Frank's chest. Dr. Hendricks was a kind man, but he was also a mandatory reporter. If Frank appeared to be experiencing age-related cognitive decline, if he started talking about 50 years of encounters with impossible creatures, the doctor would have no choice but to recommend immediate evaluation. Sunset Manor would become the best-case scenario. Frank forced his breathing to slow, drawing on decades of experience calming frightened animals. I'm all right, sweetheart. This is difficult to explain. Then maybe you shouldn't try to explain it right now. Sarah's hand touched his shoulder, gentle but firm. Maybe we should focus on practical things. Your health, your safety, making sure you're not carrying unnecessary stress. Standing there in the basement stairwell, Frank realized he faced an impossible choice. Reveal his secret and risk confirming his daughter's worst fears about his mental state, or remain silent and allow himself to be removed from the one place where 50 years of careful observation might finally yield answers to questions that had shaped his entire adult life. Tonight was the full moon. In 8 hours, the Guardian would appear at the tree line, expecting Frank to maintain their ancient vigil. The weight of that responsibility made his decision. I need you to see, Frank said, his voice gaining strength as he descended the remaining steps. Whatever happens after tonight, I need someone else to know. The basement study opened before them like a shrine to the impossible. Sarah's sharp intake of breath echoed in the confined space as Frank switched on the overhead light, illuminating 5 decades of meticulous documentation. The walls were covered with hundreds of photographs arranged in chronological order, blurry shapes that gradually became more distinct as Frank's equipment improved over the years. File cabinets lined one entire wall, their drawers labeled by decade and encounter type. A massive map of the property dominated the far wall, marked with red pins indicating sighting locations, blue for physical evidence, yellow for vocalizations. Dad. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. What is all this? Frank moved to his desk, where the most recent journal lay open to last month's entries. His handwriting might have grown shakier, but the observations remained precise. Behavioral patterns, weather conditions, duration of encounters. 50 years of evidence. 50 years of something that science says can't exist, but shows up every full moon like clockwork. Sarah stepped closer to examine the photographs, her professional composure cracking as she processed the scope of the archive. These are supposed to be what, exactly? The Guardian. Frank pulled his most recent photograph from the desk drawer, a clear image captured with a telephoto lens showing a massive bipedal figure standing at the tree line. I call him that because that's what he does. He guards something, watches over something, and for 50 years, I've been part of that process. The silence stretched between them as Sarah studied the photograph. Frank watched her face cycle through disbelief, concern, and something that might have been recognition. Dad, this could be doctored. Digital manipulation is... Most of these were taken with film cameras, developed in this basement. Frank gestured toward the makeshift darkroom in the corner. I have negatives going back to 1973, plaster casts of footprints, audio recordings. He moved to a filing cabinet and withdrew a cast measuring nearly 14 inches long. Tell me how I fabricated this. Sarah took the cast with trembling hands, running her fingers along the detailed impressions of claws and pad structure. The weight of it, the precise anatomical details, the way aging had yellowed the plaster, everything about it spoke to authenticity. I don't understand. If this is real, why haven't you reported it? Why keep it secret? Because the moment I make this public, it ends. Frank's voice carried the weight of decades of careful consideration. Government agencies, researchers, media, they'd turn this into a circus. The Guardian would disappear, and 50 years of observation would be destroyed by people who want to capture rather than understand. He pulled out his earliest journal, the leather cover worn smooth by handling. Margaret knew. She never saw him directly, but she knew why I had to be here every full moon, why I couldn't travel or stay away overnight when the timing was wrong. Mom knew about this? Sarah's voice cracked slightly. She helped me understand that some things are more important than proof. Some relationships exist outside normal boundaries. Frank moved to the map, pointing to the pattern of red pins. Look at the sighting locations over 50 years. See how they form a perimeter around the old logging camp? He's protecting something, Sarah, guarding it. And somehow, I became part of that protection. The weight of revelation was settling over Sarah like a physical presence. Frank could see her struggling between professional skepticism and the undeniable evidence surrounding them. The sheer volume of documentation, the consistency of details across decades, the careful scientific methodology. It was too comprehensive for delusion, too consistent for fabrication. Tonight's a full moon, Frank continued, his voice gaining urgency. In 6 hours, he'll appear at the tree line. He's never missed an appearance, and I've never failed to witness it. If I leave this place, if you take me to Sunset Manor, that pattern breaks. 50 years of trust destroyed. Sarah set down the plaster cast and turned to face her father fully. What are you saying, Dad? I'm saying that everything you think you know about me, about this property, about what's possible in this world, it's all wrong. Frank moved to stand directly in front of his daughter, his hands steady now, with purpose. I'm saying that I'm not a lonely old man losing his grip on reality. I'm the keeper of something extraordinary, and tonight you're going to see it for yourself. The basement fell silent except for the distant ticking of the grandfather clock upstairs, marking time toward an encounter that would change everything. Frank had crossed his threshold. There was no returning to the safety of secrecy, no retreating into the comfortable isolation that had protected his impossible truth for 5 decades. Tonight, everything would change. For better or worse, Frank had committed to a path that would either vindicate 50 years of patient observation or destroy the last vestige of his daughter's faith in his sanity. The choice was made. Now they could only wait for the full moon to rise. The silence stretched until Sarah finally spoke, her voice hollow with the weight of processing the impossible. Dad, if this is real, if what you're showing me is actually real, then waiting for tonight isn't just about proving something to me. It's dangerous. Frank had been so focused on convincing his daughter that he hadn't considered how she might react once convinced. The look on Sarah's face wasn't skepticism anymore. It was fear, professional fear, the kind that came from years of assessing risk and liability. We need to call someone, Sarah continued, moving toward the stairs. The Department of Natural Resources, maybe the sheriff. If there's a large predator on your property. No! Frank's voice cut through the basement air with surprising force. That's exactly what can't happen. Dad, listen to yourself. You're talking about a creature that could kill you. That's been stalking your property for 50 years. Sarah's social worker training was taking over, analyzing threat assessment and vulnerable adult safety protocols. This isn't about your research anymore. This is about survival. Frank felt the familiar weight of defending something no one else understood. He's not stalking. He's maintaining a pattern. There's a difference. A pattern that involves a massive predator appearing at your home every month. Sarah's voice rose with frustration and terror. Do you hear how insane that sounds? Even if everything down here is real, it means you've been in mortal danger for decades. The accusation hit Frank harder than skepticism ever had, because Sarah wasn't wrong. From any rational perspective, his behavior looked suicidal. What sane person maintained regular contact with something that could tear them apart? You don't understand the rules yet. What rules? Frank moved to a different filing cabinet, withdrawing a leather-bound journal from 1982. The rules I've learned over 50 years of careful observation. Rule 1, he appears only during full moons. Rule 2, he maintains a minimum distance of 30 yards. Rule 3, he observes but doesn't approach. Rule 4, he leaves gifts, elk carcasses, sometimes deer, at specific locations. He flipped through pages of meticulous notes, showing Sarah detailed behavioral observations. Rule 5, he responds to certain actions but ignores others. If I turn off the kitchen light early, he leaves immediately. If I move to other windows, he shifts position to maintain visual contact. If I come outside... Frank paused, his throat tightening. I've only tested that once. In 1987. He retreated immediately but returned the following month. Sarah studied the journal entries, her analytical mind processing patterns despite her fear. This reads like ethological research, animal behavior documentation, because that's what it is. Frank felt a surge of vindication. I'm a veterinarian, Sarah. I know how to observe animal behavior objectively. What I've documented isn't random encounters, it's structured interaction between two species following established protocols. Protocols that could change. Sarah's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many situations deteriorate. Animal behavior isn't static, Dad. Stress, environmental changes, aging, any number of factors could alter his pattern, make him more aggressive, more unpredictable. The possibility had haunted Frank for years, but he'd never articulated it to another person. That's why the observation is so important, why breaking the pattern could be catastrophic, or why maintaining it is suicidal. Sarah closed the journal with sharp finality. Dad, I can't let you stay here knowing this. I won't be responsible for what might happen. Frank felt the walls of his carefully constructed world beginning to collapse. So what are you suggesting? That I abandon 50 years of the most important research anyone's ever conducted? That I break faith with something that's trusted me for half a century? I'm suggesting that your safety matters more than research. Sarah's voice softened with the tone Frank remembered from her childhood, gentle but immovable. Even if this creature has been peaceful, even if there are patterns, you're 74 years old. Your reflexes aren't what they were. Your judgment might be compromised by isolation and grief. My judgment is fine. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, a rational person would have reported this decades ago. A rational person wouldn't have kept this secret, wouldn't have maintained contact with something potentially dangerous. Sarah gestured around the basement archive. This level of obsession, this isolation, this secret-keeping, it's not healthy, Dad, even if every piece of evidence here is authentic. Frank felt something cold settle in his chest as he recognized the trap he'd created for himself. Reveal the secret and appear obsessed. Keep the secret and appear delusional. Either way, Sarah's professional training led to the same conclusion. He was an at-risk elderly adult who needed intervention. 6 hours, he said quietly. Give me 6 hours to prove that everything I've told you is real. If the Guardian appears tonight, if you see him with your own eyes, then we discuss what happens next as equal partners. If he doesn't appear... Frank's voice faltered as he contemplated failure after 50 years of perfect consistency. If he doesn't appear, then I'll go with you to Sunset Manor tomorrow. Sarah studied her father's face, seeing determination mixed with desperation. And if he does appear, but he's aggressive. If the pattern changes tonight. Frank moved to his desk and withdrew something Sarah hadn't noticed before, an old hunting rifle, meticulously maintained despite its age. Then we'll learn together why some rules should never be broken. Sarah stared at the rifle with the same expression she might reserve for a live grenade. Dad, no, absolutely not. It's a precaution. Frank checked the chamber, empty as always, before setting the weapon carefully against his desk. I've never loaded it, never even brought it upstairs during an encounter. But tonight is different. Tonight there are two of us. Different how? Sarah's voice carried the sharp edge of someone recognizing a situation spiraling beyond control. Are you saying his behavior changes when there are witnesses? Frank realized he didn't know. In 50 years, he'd never had a witness to an encounter. Margaret had always found reasons to visit her sister during full moon weekends, claiming she needed the social connection but never acknowledging the timing. The pattern had been so consistent that Frank had never considered variables. I don't know, he admitted, the uncertainty hitting him like a physical weight. You're right, this is uncharted territory. The admission seemed to crack something inside Sarah. She sank into the basement's single chair, her professional composure finally crumbling. God, Dad. What if your presence has been preventing something terrible? What if the moment you're not here, he comes looking for you? It was a possibility Frank had avoided contemplating, but Sarah's fear forced him to confront it. If the Guardian's monthly vigil was somehow dependent on Frank's response, if their strange relationship had evolved into mutual obligation rather than simple observation, then his absence might trigger unpredictable behavior. The township, Sarah continued, her voice growing urgent. Mrs. Hendricks, the Kramers down the road. If he's territorial about this area, and you're suddenly gone. Frank felt the weight of responsibility shifting, expanding beyond his personal commitment to something larger. He's never shown interest in other properties. The sightings are always here, always focused on the old logging camp. That you know of. Sarah was fully in crisis management mode now, her training taking over. How many missing persons reports in this county over 50 years? How many unexplained animal attacks? How many people avoided this area without understanding why? The questions hit Frank like accusations. He'd been so focused on documenting his encounters that he'd never researched whether the Guardian's presence had broader implications. The isolation he'd treasured, the sense of being the sole witness to something extraordinary, suddenly felt like selfish negligence. We need to establish protocols, Sarah said, rising from the chair with renewed purpose. If we're doing this, if I'm staying tonight to observe, then we do it safely. Frank felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. You're staying? I'm staying because leaving you alone with this is unconscionable. But we're doing it my way. Sarah moved to the rifle, expertly checking the action before securing it again. First rule, we observe from inside the house. Windows only, no outdoor contact. Agreed. Second rule, we maintain communication. I have my cell phone, you have the landline. If anything goes wrong, we call for help immediately. Frank nodded, though he wondered who would believe them. Third rule, if his behavior deviates from your documented patterns by any significant degree, we leave. Tonight. No discussion, no further observation. The thought of abandoning 50 years of careful work after a single anomaly made Frank's chest tighten, but Sarah's fear was infectious. What constitutes significant deviation? Approaching closer than 30 yards. Vocalizing in ways you haven't recorded. Any aggressive posturing. Any attempt to approach the house. Sarah's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to life or death decisions. Dad, I need you to understand. I'm not just protecting you tonight. I'm protecting everyone who lives within 50 miles of this place. The scope of potential responsibility settled over Frank like a lead blanket. For 50 years, he'd thought of himself as a privileged observer of something miraculous. Now he was being forced to consider that he might be the only thing standing between a powerful predator and an unsuspecting rural community. There's something else, Frank said quietly. Something I didn't mention earlier. Sarah's face went pale. What? Frank retrieved his most recent journal, flipping to entries from the past 6 months. The duration of encounters has been increasing. Used to be 45 minutes, rarely more than an hour, but since spring he's been staying longer. Sometimes until dawn. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I'm not sure what it means. Frank's voice carried the weight of months of growing unease. Could be natural behavioral evolution. Could be environmental factors, development pressure, climate change affecting prey patterns. Or what? Frank met his daughter's eyes, seeing his own fear reflected there. Or he's been waiting for something, building toward something. And tonight, with you here, we might finally discover what that something is. The basement fell silent except for the distant sound of wind in the pines above. Outside, afternoon was fading toward evening. In 3 hours, the sun would set. In 5 hours, the full moon would rise above the tree line where something impossible had waited with inhuman patience for half a century. Tonight, Frank and Sarah would learn whether that patience was finally at an end. The grandfather clock's chimes echoed through the house at 7:30, each note seeming to hang in the air longer than the last. Frank stood at the kitchen window, watching the tree line where shadows had begun to gather like pooled ink. Sarah sat at the table behind him, her phone charging beside a thermos of coffee neither of them had touched. "How much longer?" she asked, though they both knew the answer. "Moonrise is at 10:47. He usually appears 15 to 20 minutes after the moon clears the trees." Frank's voice sounded strange to his own ears, steady but hollow, like an actor delivering familiar lines to an audience that might not applaud. "We have 3 hours. 3 hours to sit with the weight of what they'd unleashed." Frank had spent the afternoon moving through the house like a man preparing for siege, checking window locks he'd never bothered with, positioning chairs for optimal sightlines, testing the beam of every flashlight. Sarah had made phone calls to her office, postponing tomorrow's appointments, to her neighbor, arranging extended care for her cat. Small preparations that acknowledged the possibility they might not return to normal schedules. "Tell me about the first time," Sarah said suddenly. 1973. What made you stay instead of running?" Frank closed his eyes, letting himself fall back through decades of accumulated certainty to that moment of pure terror and wonder. "I was 24, fresh out of vet school, thought I knew everything about animal behavior. I'd bought this place because it was cheap. No one wanted property this isolated." He turned from the window, meeting his daughter's eyes. The real estate agent mentioned local superstitions, but I assumed he meant ghost stories, logging accidents maybe. Nothing that would interest a rational man of science. "But you saw him that first night." "I saw something impossible. 9 feet tall, walking upright but wrong. Too fluid, too powerful. The moonlight caught his eyes and they reflected like a wolf's, but the intelligence behind them." Frank shook his head. "I knew I was looking at something that could kill me without effort, but I also knew I was seeing something that changed everything we think we know about the world." Sarah's phone buzzed, a text message that made her frown. "My supervisor, wondering about tomorrow's case reviews." She set the phone aside without responding. 48 hours ago, case reviews were the most important thing in my world. The admission carried a weight Frank recognized. The moment when ordinary concerns revealed themselves as elaborate distractions from larger truths. He'd felt it that first night in 1973, and again when Margaret died, and now watching his daughter grapple with the same fundamental shift in perspective. "Are you afraid?" he asked. Terrified. Sarah's honesty was startling in its directness, but not of the creature. "I'm afraid of what happens after tonight. If he appears, if everything you've documented is real, then I have to live in a world where something like that exists, where my father has been sharing his property with a predator for 50 years and somehow survived." Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through old window frames. "And if he doesn't appear, then I have to live with the knowledge that you've been alone here for years, creating an elaborate fantasy to cope with isolation and grief." Sarah's voice broke slightly. "Either way, everything changes. Either I'm taking my father away from something extraordinary, or I'm committing him to an institution because he can't distinguish reality from delusion. The brutal honesty of it hit Frank like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on proving his case that he hadn't fully considered the impossible position he was forcing Sarah into. No matter what happened tonight, her relationship with him, with reality itself, would be forever altered. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for putting this burden on you. Don't apologize yet." Sarah stood, moving to join him at the window. "Save that for after we know what we're dealing with." Outside, full darkness was settling over the pine forest. The familiar landscape of Frank's daily life was transforming into something alien and expectant. Every shadow could hide watching eyes. Every shift of branches in the wind could mask approaching footsteps. Frank checked his watch. 8:15. 2.5 hours until moonrise. 2.5 hours to sit with the growing certainty that tonight would shatter everything, either his carefully documented relationship with something impossible or his daughter's faith in his sanity. For the first time in 50 years, Frank found himself hoping the guardian wouldn't appear. The weight of proof suddenly seemed heavier than the weight of doubt. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was too late for such wishes. Something was already moving in the darkness beyond the tree line. Something that had been waiting with inhuman patience for this moment of revelation. The ordeal had begun. Frank froze at the kitchen window, his breath fogging the glass as he pressed closer. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Something's wrong." She moved beside him, following his gaze into the darkness. "What do you mean?" "The timing. He's never early. Never." Frank's hands trembled as he gripped the windowsill. 50 years of perfect consistency, and tonight, when you're here, he breaks the pattern. Through the trees, a massive shadow moved with unnatural stillness, too large and too upright to be anything natural. Even at this distance, even in the darkness, Frank could see the amber gleam of eyes that had haunted his dreams for decades. But something was different. The guardian wasn't maintaining his usual position at the edge of the logging camp. He was moving closer, each step deliberate and purposeful. 30 yards, Frank breathed, watching the creature's approach with growing dread. 25. He's breaking rule number 2. Sarah grabbed his arm. "We leave, now. You said if his behavior deviated..." 20 yards. Frank's voice cracked as 50 years of careful understanding crumbled before his eyes. "This isn't supposed to happen. He's never..." The guardian stopped at 15 yards from the house and raised his massive head. Even through the window, Frank could see the intelligent assessment in those amber eyes, no longer the distant observation he'd grown accustomed to, but something immediate and personal. Something that acknowledged Sarah's presence and judged it as a violation of their unspoken pact. Then the creature opened his mouth and released a sound Frank had never heard before, not the distant howl that occasionally echoed across the property, but something else entirely. A low, rumbling vocalization that carried unmistakable meaning despite its alien origin. A sound of disappointment, of betrayal. "He knows," Frank whispered, the realization hitting him like ice water. "He knows I brought a witness. After 50 years of keeping the secret, he knows I broke faith." The guardian's massive form shifted, and for the first time since 1973, Frank felt genuine terror. This wasn't the patient watcher who had observed him through countless full moons. This was something angry, something whose trust had been shattered by Frank's decision to share their secret relationship. Sarah was pulling at his arm, her voice urgent but distant through his shock. "Dad, we need to call someone. The sheriff, the state police." "No." Frank turned from the window with desperate certainty. "Don't you understand? He's not just angry about you being here. He's ending it. 50 years of whatever this was between us, and I destroyed it by bringing you into it." But when Frank looked back toward the tree line, his heart stopped completely. The guardian was gone. Vanished into the forest with the same impossible silence that had marked his appearances for half a century. The empty space where he'd stood seemed to mock Frank's lifetime of careful documentation. Where did he go? Sarah pressed closer to the window, scanning the darkness. Frank felt something fundamental break inside his chest. He left. For the first time in 50 years, he left early. The words came out in a whisper of devastation. The pattern is broken. The relationship is over. Sarah's relief was palpable as she moved away from the window. Thank God. Maybe this is for the best, Dad. Maybe... You don't understand. Frank sank into a kitchen chair, feeling every one of his 74 years settle into his bones. This wasn't just about observation. This was about trust, about some kind of agreement I never fully understood but never questioned. And now it's gone. The house felt different around them. No longer the safe haven Frank had known for decades, but something exposed and vulnerable. For 50 years, he'd lived under the Guardian's watchful protection without realizing it. The creature's presence had been a ward against other dangers, a sign that this territory was claimed and guarded. Now that presence was gone, withdrawn not by natural conclusion, but by Frank's betrayal of whatever bond had existed between them. "He'll never come back," Frank said, the certainty of it crushing him more than any physical pain. 50 years of the most important relationship of my life, and I destroyed it for proof, for validation. Sarah knelt beside his chair, her earlier fear replaced by heartbreak for her father's obvious anguish. "Dad, maybe this is what needed to happen. Maybe the relationship was keeping you trapped here, preventing you from moving on with your life." Frank looked at his daughter and saw the terrible irony of their situation. She believed she was saving him from delusion, while he knew she'd just witnessed the destruction of something irreplaceable. Tomorrow she'd remember a frightening encounter with her father's mental breakdown. He'd remember the night he lost the most extraordinary connection of his life. Outside, the October wind picked up, rattling windows and sending dead leaves skittering across the yard where Amber eyes would never watch again. The grandfather clock chimed 9:30, marking time in a world that had suddenly become smaller, emptier, and infinitely more ordinary. The 50-year vigil was over, and Frank had never felt more alone. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, broken only by the wind's mournful passage through the pines. Frank sat motionless in his kitchen chair, staring at the empty darkness beyond the window, while Sarah hovered nearby with the helpless expression of someone watching a loved one grieve something she couldn't comprehend. Then Frank's head snapped up, his eyes suddenly sharp with a realization that cut through his despair like lightning. "Wait," he whispered, rising so quickly that Sarah stepped back. Wait. He moved to the window again, pressing his face against the glass. He didn't leave angry. He left because the moon hasn't risen yet. "Dad, what are you?" "The pattern." Frank's voice carried growing excitement and terror in equal measure. 50 years of perfect consistency, and tonight I thought he was breaking it. But what if he wasn't breaking the pattern? What if he was preparing for something different? Sarah's face went pale. "What do you mean?" Frank spun from the window, his mind racing through decades of carefully recorded observations. He appeared early. He came closer than ever before. He acknowledged your presence directly. His hands shook as the implications crystallized. "Sarah, what if tonight wasn't supposed to be another observation? What if tonight was supposed to be an introduction?" The words hung in the air like an accusation. Frank felt the terrible weight of understanding settling over him. Not just what had happened, but what was supposed to have happened. For 50 years, the Guardian had been waiting, not simply watching, but waiting for something specific. And tonight, with Sarah present, that wait was finally meant to end. "Oh God," Frank breathed, sinking back into his chair as the full scope of his mistake became clear. He wasn't angry about you being here. He was expecting you to be here. This was always supposed to happen. The next generation, the passing of whatever this responsibility is. Sarah backed toward the kitchen door. "Dad, you're scaring me. You're talking like this creature has been planning something for decades." "Because he has been." Frank's voice cracked with the weight of revelation. "Don't you see? Margaret and I never had children for 30 years. Then you came along when I was 47. Late in life, unexpected. He looked up at his daughter with dawning horror. What if that wasn't coincidence? What if somehow, some way, your birth was part of whatever arrangement has kept me safe here all this time? The suggestion was impossible, insane, but it explained everything Frank had never understood about his relationship with the Guardian. The creature's patience, the gifts of elk carcasses that had kept Frank fed through lean years, the sense of protection he'd always felt on his isolated property. The way the Guardian had appeared that first night in 1973, just months after Frank had moved to the area, not as a threat, but as something that had been waiting for his arrival. You're saying this thing has been, what? Orchestrating my life? Sarah's voice rose with panic and disbelief. Manipulating events so that I'd exist, so that I'd be here tonight? Frank stood again, moving to his decades of journals stacked on the counter. With shaking hands, he flipped through pages of careful documentation, searching for the pattern he'd been too close to see. Look at the dates. Look at the behavioral changes. His finger traced entries spanning decades. 1987, the year after you were born, his visits became longer, more purposeful. 1995, when you started school, he began leaving larger offerings, as if he was providing for a family instead of just one man. Sarah stared at the journals as if they were cursed artifacts. This is insane. You're describing some kind of supernatural arranged marriage between our family and a monster. Not marriage, Frank said quietly, the truth settling over him like a shroud. Guardianship, stewardship. He's been protecting this territory and I've been his, I don't know what to call it. His human anchor? His liaison with civilization? He looked up at Sarah with eyes full of terrible understanding. And tonight, he was ready to pass that responsibility to you. The grandfather clock chimed 10 o'clock, and both father and daughter turned toward the sound with shared dread. In 47 minutes, the moon would clear the trees. In 47 minutes, they would learn whether Frank's betrayal had destroyed something irreplaceable, or whether the Guardian's patience extended to second chances. He'll come back, Frank said with growing certainty. He has to come back. Whatever this arrangement is, it's bigger than my mistake tonight, bigger than both of us. Sarah moved to the rifle, her hands steady despite her fear. And if he does come back, if you're right about all this, what exactly do you think he expects from me? Frank met his daughter's eyes and saw his own transformation reflected there, the moment when everything certain became uncertain, when the impossible revealed itself as inevitable. I think, he said quietly, we're about to find out what I've really been preparing for all these years. The weight of Frank's revelation settled between them like a physical presence, transforming the familiar kitchen into something alien and charged with purpose. For the first time since Sarah's arrival, Frank felt the crushing despair of the Guardian's early departure begin to lift, replaced by something more complex, hope tangled with terror, understanding braided with dread. If you're right about this, Sarah said slowly, her voice steadier than Frank had expected, then running away isn't an option anymore, is it? Frank shook his head, watching his daughter process the impossible with the same methodical precision she brought to her legal work. I don't think it ever was, not for me, not for 50 years. And maybe not for you either. Sarah moved away from the rifle, her posture shifting from defensive to something approaching acceptance. Show me everything. If I'm supposed to inherit some kind of supernatural responsibility, I need to understand what that means. The request sent Frank into motion with renewed purpose. He gathered his journals from the counter, spreading them across the kitchen table in chronological order, 50 years of careful documentation that suddenly revealed itself as an instruction manual he'd been unconsciously writing for his daughter. Start with this one, he said, opening the earliest journal to November 1973. The night everything changed. As Sarah read his younger self's careful documentation of that first encounter, Frank found himself studying her face for signs of the transformation he remembered experiencing, the moment when the impossible became simply another fact requiring accommodation. Her frown deepened as she absorbed his descriptions of the Guardian's intelligence, his purposeful behavior, the unmistakable sense of being evaluated rather than merely observed. "You wrote that you felt like you were being interviewed," she said, looking up from the journal. "Not hunted, not threatened, interviewed. For a position I didn't know I was applying for." Frank pulled out maps he'd drawn over the decades, showing the Guardian's patrol routes through the forest, the territories he seemed to protect, the invisible boundaries he maintained. "Look at this pattern. He's not just living here. He's managing this entire section of forest, keeping other predators away, maintaining some kind of balance I never fully understood." Sarah studied the maps with growing fascination, her fear giving way to professional curiosity. "These patrol routes are incredibly sophisticated, almost like he's running a conservation program." "Exactly." Frank felt the first spark of excitement he'd experienced since the Guardian's early departure. "And I think I've been his human liaison with the outside world, keeping hikers and hunters away from sensitive areas, reporting unusual animal behavior to the DNR, maintaining the illusion that this is just another stretch of empty wilderness." They worked through the journals together, father and daughter, building a shared understanding of something neither had imagined possible hours earlier. Frank watched Sarah's transformation with amazement. The same stubborn intelligence that had made her dismiss his research now turned toward accepting and analyzing it. She asked sharp questions about the Guardian's behavior patterns, his apparent communication attempts, the significance of his gift-giving. "These elk carcasses," she said, studying photographs Frank had taken over the years. "They're not random kills. Look at the timing. Always during harsh winters, always when your food supplies would be running low." She looked up at him with something approaching awe. "He's been taking care of you for 50 years, Frank confirmed, "and I never fully understood why until tonight." Sarah closed the final journal and sat back in her chair, the weight of accumulated evidence settling around her like a mantle. "If this is real, if everything you've documented is actually happening, then we're dealing with something extraordinary, something that challenges every assumption about intelligence, evolution, coexistence." Frank felt a surge of pride at his daughter's courage in the face of the impossible. "And if he comes back tonight? If he gives us another chance?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkness beyond the window where amber eyes might soon appear. When she spoke, her voice carried the same determined precision Frank remembered from her childhood, the tone she used when accepting a challenge that frightened but didn't defeat her. "Then I listen," she said simply. "I try to understand what he needs from me, what this arrangement actually means." She met Frank's eyes with steady resolve. "And I try not to let 50 years of trust and protection end because I was too scared to accept something larger than my understanding of the world." Frank felt tears he hadn't expected sting his eyes. For the first time since the Guardian's departure, he believed redemption might be possible, not just for his mistake tonight, but for decades of incomplete understanding, of accepting protection without grasping the full weight of responsibility that came with it. Outside, the wind had died to almost nothing, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The grandfather clock's steady ticking seemed to grow louder in the stillness, marking time toward a confrontation that would either restore a broken covenant or confirm its permanent destruction. But now, for the first time in hours, Frank wasn't facing that possibility alone. The kitchen fell into a profound silence, broken only by the grandfather clock's relentless marking of time. Frank found himself staring at Sarah with an emotion he'd almost forgotten how to feel, paternal pride untainted by disappointment or regret. For the first time in decades, he wasn't the only person who understood the weight of what lived in these woods. "We should prepare," Frank said finally, rising from his chair with renewed purpose. "If he comes back, if we get another chance, we can't afford to repeat tonight's mistakes." Sarah nodded, her transformation from skeptic to co-conspirator complete. "What kind of preparation? What should I expect?" Frank moved to a kitchen drawer and withdrew a small digital recorder, the same device he'd used to capture the Guardian's vocalizations over the years. "He's intelligent, more intelligent than anything we're equipped to understand. But he's also been patient for 5 decades. If he returns, it won't be to harm us. It'll be to finish what should have happened tonight. The certainty in his own voice surprised Frank. Hours ago, he'd been consumed by the fear that his betrayal had destroyed everything. Now, surrounded by 50 years of evidence spread across his kitchen table, he understood that some arrangements transcend individual mistakes. The Guardian hadn't maintained his vigil for half a century to abandon it over one moment of human uncertainty. "Dad," Sarah said quietly, "when you first moved here in '73, what brought you to this specific property? This exact location in the middle of nowhere?" Frank paused, the recorder halfway to his pocket. It was a question he'd never asked himself, despite decades of analyzing every other aspect of his relationship with the Guardian. The realtor said it was a good deal, cheap because of the isolation. Good for a veterinarian who wanted to semi-retire. What was the realtor's name? The question hit Frank like a physical blow. He'd never thought to document that detail, never considered it relevant to his research. But now, with the full scope of the Guardian's apparent influence becoming clear, every coincidence demanded scrutiny. "I don't remember," he admitted, the words carrying the weight of a revelation he wasn't sure he wanted to pursue. 50 years ago, and I can remember every detail of that first encounter, but I can't recall the name of the person who brought me here." Sarah's expression grew troubled. "What if your coming here wasn't coincidence either? What if the Guardian has been orchestrating this arrangement longer than we realized?" The implication sent a chill through Frank that had nothing to do with the October night. If Sarah was right, if his entire life in these woods had been guided by forces beyond his understanding, then his identity as an independent researcher became something else entirely, a role he'd been unconsciously performing in someone else's design. "It doesn't matter now," Frank said, though the words felt hollow. "Whatever brought me here, whatever's kept me here, tonight determines whether it continues." He checked his watch. 23 minutes until moonrise. They spent the remaining time in careful preparation. Frank positioned his recording equipment near the window, ensuring clear audio capture of any vocalizations. Sarah studied his photographs, familiarizing herself with the Guardian's physical characteristics and behavioral patterns. They moved with the focused efficiency of researchers preparing for a critical experiment, but Frank could feel the underlying tension that made their hands shake and their voices catch. At 10:44 p.m., the grandfather clock's chiming seemed to echo through the house with unusual resonance. Frank found himself at the window, Sarah beside him, both staring into the darkness where the tree line met the clearing. The moon hadn't yet cleared the canopy, but its glow was beginning to filter through the upper branches, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow that could hide any number of watching forms. "There," Sarah whispered. Frank followed her gaze and felt his heart stop. A massive silhouette stood at the forest's edge, motionless and patient. The Guardian had returned, but something was different. Where his earlier appearance had carried the weight of betrayed trust, this presence felt expectant. Waiting. "He's giving us another chance," Frank breathed, reaching for the recorder with trembling fingers. But as the moon finally cleared the trees, washing the clearing in silver light, the Guardian did something unprecedented in 50 years of encounters. He stepped forward. Not the single cautious step Frank had occasionally witnessed, but multiple deliberate strides that brought him closer to the house than he'd ever come. 20 yards, 15, 10. Sarah gripped Frank's arm, her breathing shallow but controlled. "He's not just coming back, he's coming to us." The Guardian stopped just outside the circle of light cast by the house's exterior lamp. Up close, his massive form was even more imposing than Frank's documentation had captured, easily 8 feet tall, with intelligent amber eyes that reflected the moonlight like mirrors. But it wasn't his size that made Frank's breath catch. It was the unmistakable sense of purpose in his posture, the weight of decision in his steady gaze. After 50 years of careful distance, the Guardian was finally ready to close the gap between their worlds. The Guardian's massive form filled Frank's vision, closer than any nightmare, more imposing than 50 years of distant observation could have prepared him for. In the harsh circle of lamplight, Every detail became terrifyingly clear. The intelligence burning in those amber eyes, the deliberate control in each breath that misted in the cold air, the way his massive hands hung loose at his sides, ready but not threatening. Frank's fingers found the recorder's power button, muscle memory from decades of documentation overriding the paralysis of awe. But as the device clicked to life, the Guardian's head tilted slightly, an unmistakably human gesture of curiosity that sent ice through Frank's veins. "He knows what that is," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The Guardian's gaze shifted to Sarah, and Frank felt the weight of that attention like a physical force. For long seconds, creature and woman studied each other across the impossible gulf between species, between worlds Frank had never imagined could touch. Then the Guardian did something that shattered the last of Frank's assumptions about their relationship. He spoke. Not the guttural vocalizations Frank had occasionally recorded, but words, heavily accented, carefully formed, but unmistakably English. "You brought her." The voice was deep, resonant, carrying undertones that seemed to vibrate in Frank's chest. Finally, Frank's legs nearly gave out. 50 years of silent encounters, of gifts left and received, of careful observation across an unbridgeable divide. And the Guardian had been capable of conversation the entire time. You can speak." The words tumbled from Frank's mouth, inadequate and obvious. Those amber eyes turned back to him, and Frank saw something that might have been disappointment. "You never asked the right questions, Guardian Keeper. 50 seasons you watched, 50 seasons you recorded. Never once did you wonder why I chose you." The term hit Frank like a physical blow. Guardian Keeper. Not researcher, not observer, but something with formal weight, ancestral purpose. "I don't understand." "No." The Guardian's massive head shook slowly. "You understand pieces, fragments, but never the whole." His attention returned to Sarah, and when he spoke again, his voice carried notes of something Frank had never expected. Hope. But she might. Sarah stepped forward, and Frank's protective instincts screamed at him to pull her back, to place himself between his daughter and this impossible creature. But something in her posture, her steady breathing, told him this moment belonged to her. "What do you want from us?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the tremor Frank could see in her hands. "Not want," the Guardian replied. "Need. Your kind spreads like fire across the earth. Our kind retreats, diminishes, fades into legend." He gestured toward the forest around them with one massive hand. "But here, balance remains. Here, the old agreements hold." Frank found his voice again, the researcher in him overwhelming his fear. "Agreements? What agreements?" The Guardian's expression shifted, amber eyes narrowing with what might have been frustration. "Before your cities, before your roads carved the world into pieces, when your kind was young and knew their place in the greater pattern." He stepped closer to the window, and Frank had to fight the urge to retreat. "Some of your people understood. Some accepted the responsibility of keeping the boundaries." "Boundaries between what?" Sarah asked. "Between chaos and order. Between taking everything and leaving enough." The Guardian's voice grew deeper, more resonant, as if the words carried the weight of centuries. "Your father's father's father knew these truths. The knowledge was passed down, keeper to keeper, until your kind forgot and the old ways were lost." Frank felt the pieces clicking together like tumblers in a lock. "That's why you chose me, not randomly, because of my bloodline?" "Because you carried the capacity, even diminished." The Guardian nodded slowly. "But you were alone. The knowledge dies with one person. It must be shared, passed forward, or the agreements fail entirely." Sarah stepped closer to the window, close enough that her breath fogged the glass. "And if the agreements fail?" For the first time since his appearance, something like fear flickered across the Guardian's massive features. "Then we become legend entirely, and your kind faces what comes after us alone." The words hung in the air like a prophecy, heavy with implications Frank couldn't begin to process. But Sarah, with her lawyer's instinct for cutting through complexity to essential truth, asked the question that mattered most. "What do you need us to do?" The Guardian studied her for a long moment, and Frank saw approval in those ancient eyes. "Accept what your bloodline was meant to carry. Learn what your father only glimpsed. Choose whether the old ways survive or die with this generation." Frank felt the full weight of 50 years settling on his shoulders, not just the encounters he'd documented, but the responsibility he'd never fully understood. This was the test he'd been unconsciously preparing for since 1973. Not just his willingness to accept the impossible, but his daughter's readiness to inherit something far greater and more terrifying than he'd ever imagined. The Guardian stepped back from the circle of light, but his voice carried clearly through the night air. "Choose now, both of you. The moon will not wait." The weight of the Guardian's ultimatum settled over them like a shroud. Frank felt the decades of his carefully documented research crumbling into insignificance. He'd been studying symptoms while remaining blind to the disease. Sarah stood frozen at the window, her breath creating expanding circles of fog on the glass as she stared at the massive figure just beyond the light. "Choose what? Exactly?" Sarah's voice carried the sharp edge Frank remembered from her childhood, the tone she used when adults gave her incomplete answers. "You're talking about agreements, responsibilities, bloodlines. But what does that actually mean?" The Guardian's amber eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made Frank step instinctively closer to his daughter. "It means becoming what your ancestor was before the forgetting began. It means understanding that your kind's dominion comes with obligations your people abandoned." Frank's mind raced through implications he didn't want to accept. "You're saying my family, we were supposed to be some kind of intermediaries?" "Guardians guard," the creature replied, his massive form shifting in the moonlight. "Guardian keepers keep the guardians, ensure the balance holds, prevent the chaos that comes when one species claims everything and leaves nothing for the rest." The simplicity of it hit Frank like a physical blow. 50 years of meticulous observation, and he'd missed the fundamental truth. He wasn't studying the Guardian, he was supposed to be working with him. Sarah pressed her palms against the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "And if we refuse, if we say we're not equipped for this responsibility?" The Guardian's expression grew somber, ancient sadness flickering across his features. "Then the last keeper line ends. The agreements die. And what my kind has held back for generations breaks free to reclaim what was taken." Frank felt ice forming in his chest. "What exactly have you been holding back?" For the first time, the Guardian's composure cracked. Something primal and terrifying flashed behind those intelligent eyes. Not anger, but exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness of something that had carried an impossible burden for too long. "Others of my kind who remember when your people were prey," he said quietly, "who see your cities as infections to be cleansed, who believe the only solution to humanity's expansion is humanity's extinction." The words hit the kitchen like a physical force. Frank understood with crystalline clarity that this wasn't just about maintaining some mystical balance in the Michigan wilderness. The Guardian and others like him were the only things standing between humanity and something that viewed human civilization as an existential threat. "How many?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Enough," the Guardian replied, "and growing stronger as more of our kind lose hope that coexistence remains possible." Frank watched his daughter processing this information with the same analytical intensity she'd once brought to complex legal cases. But this wasn't about corporate liability or contract disputes. This was about whether the human species survived its own success. "Show me," Sarah said suddenly, startling both Frank and the Guardian. "If I'm supposed to inherit this responsibility, show me what it actually involves." The Guardian studied her for a long moment, and Frank saw something shift in those ancient features. Surprise, giving way to what might have been respect. "You would leave the safety of your father's house? Enter the deep forest where the old ways still hold power?" "Yes." The single word carried such conviction that Frank felt simultaneous pride and terror. This was the daughter he'd raised, the one who'd never backed down from a challenge, even when wisdom suggested retreat. But this challenge could kill her, or worse, transform her into something he might not recognize. "Sarah, no," Frank said, grabbing her arm. "You don't understand what you're offering." She turned to face him, and in her eyes, Frank saw the same determined fire that had driven her to excel at everything she'd ever attempted. "I understand that we're out of time for half measures. I understand that 50 years of your careful documentation brought us to this moment." She looked back at the Guardian. "And I understand that saying no means watching everything fall apart anyway." The Guardian nodded slowly, approval and sorrow warring in his expression. "The deep forest changes those who enter. You may return with knowledge, but you will not return unchanged. Will I return human? That depends on how human you are when you enter." The cryptic response sent fresh ice through Frank's veins. "I won't let you take her. Whatever this responsibility is, whatever these agreements require, find another way." The Guardian's attention shifted back to Frank, and for the first time in 50 years of encounters, those amber eyes held something like pity. "Guardian Keeper, there is no other way. The choice was always hers to make. Your role was only to prepare her for this moment." Frank felt the final pieces of his understanding click into place with devastating clarity. Every encounter, every gift, every careful approach over 5 decades, none of it had been about him. He'd been a caretaker, preparing the way for the next generation's choice. The Guardian stepped closer to the house, moonlight catching the subtle patterns in his fur, making him seem less creature and more force of nature given form. "Choose now," he repeated. "Dawn breaks the old protections. After tonight, the choice passes beyond your bloodline forever." Frank watched his daughter's face in the moonlight, filtering through the kitchen window, seeing the moment her decision crystallized. The set of her jaw, the straightening of her shoulders. He recognized the signs from her childhood, when she'd made up her mind to climb the tallest tree or face down the neighborhood bullies. But this wasn't a childhood dare. This was a choice that would reshape everything. "I'll go," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was accepting. "But I have conditions." The Guardian's massive head tilted, an almost human gesture of curiosity. "You would bargain with necessity?" "I would ensure the best possible outcome." Sarah stepped closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she faced the creature that had haunted her father's life for 50 years. "If something happens to me in there, if I don't come back or come back, changed beyond recognition, my father lives out his days in peace. No more visits, no more responsibilities. Let him have whatever time remains." Frank felt something break inside his chest. Even now, facing the unknown, she was trying to protect him. "Sarah, you don't need to." "Yes, I do." She didn't look away from the Guardian. "And I want your word that whatever I learn, whatever I become part of, it won't require me to abandon my humanity entirely. I won't become a monster to prevent monsters." The Guardian considered this, amber eyes reflecting the kitchen light. "The path I offer may change you, but it will not corrupt you. The agreements require guardians, not destroyers." He paused, studying her with an intensity that made Frank's skin crawl. "But understand, once you enter the deep forest, once you see what lies at the heart of our compact, you cannot unknow it. The burden becomes yours to carry, just as it was meant to be your father's but never fully became." Frank stepped forward, desperation making his voice crack. "Take me instead. I'm the one who's been documenting this, preparing for this. If someone from our bloodline needs to carry this responsibility, let it be me." The Guardian's expression grew almost gentle, touched with something that might have been compassion. "Guardian Keeper, your part is ending. You maintained the connection across 50 years of forgetting. You preserved the possibility of renewed partnership. But the agreements require more than maintenance. They require renewal, adaptation to a world your ancestors never imagined." "And that requires youth?" Frank asked, though he already knew the answer. "It requires someone who can bridge the old ways and the new world," the Guardian replied. Someone who understands both the ancient compact and the modern chaos that threatens it. You have spent 50 years learning to see us. She must learn to see everything. Sarah turned from the window to face her father, and Frank saw tears glistening in her eyes despite her controlled voice. Dad, this is what you've been preparing me for my entire life, even if you didn't know it. Every story you told me about respecting nature, every lesson about the balance between civilization and wilderness, this is where it was all leading. Frank wanted to argue, to find some flaw in the Guardian's logic, or some alternative they hadn't considered. But looking at his daughter, really looking at her, he saw something he'd missed during her childhood, during all their years of careful distance. She wasn't just his daughter anymore. She was the culmination of generations of inherited purpose, the living embodiment of agreements made before recorded history. The cost, Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. What will this cost her? The Guardian's silence stretched long enough that Frank's heart began racing. When the creature finally spoke, his words carried the weight of centuries. Everything she was, to become everything she must be. The truth of it hit Frank like a physical blow. He would lose his daughter tonight, one way or another. Either she would disappear into the deep forest and never return, or she would come back transformed into something he might not recognize. The careful, controlled woman who'd driven up from Chicago would be gone forever, replaced by whatever a keeper of ancient agreements required. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was watching everything collapse. Not just their family's secret burden, but the delicate balance that had kept something terrible at bay for generations. Frank reached out and took Sarah's hand, feeling the warmth of her skin, memorizing the familiar weight of her fingers in his. I love you, he said, the words carrying 50 years of regret and pride and desperate hope. Whatever happens in there, whatever you become, remember that. Sarah squeezed his hand, then stepped toward the door. I love you too, Dad. And I finally understand why you could never leave this place. The Guardian moved back into the forest, a massive shadow among shadows, waiting for her to follow. Sarah paused at the threshold, silhouetted against the moonlit clearing, and Frank knew he was seeing the last moment of the world as he'd understood it. Then she stepped into the darkness, and the real cost of 50 years of careful preparation finally came due. Frank stood frozen in his doorway, watching the darkness swallow his daughter and the creature that had defined his life for half a century. The forest seemed to close behind them like water, leaving no trace of their passage except the fading echo of footsteps on pine needles and the terrible certainty that nothing would ever be the same. He counted his heartbeats in the silence that followed. 100, 200. The night sounds gradually returned, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through the canopy above. Normal sounds of a normal Michigan forest, as if the most important moment in human history hadn't just occurred 30 feet from his kitchen door. Frank closed the door with trembling hands and turned back to his house, suddenly seeing it with alien eyes. The careful documentation of 50 years surrounded him, photographs pinned to cork boards, audio equipment scattered across tables, notebooks filled with meticulous observations. All of it felt like childhood toys now, the innocent games of someone who'd thought he was studying a phenomenon when he'd actually been part of an ancient machinery he'd never understood. He moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching objects that should have felt familiar but somehow didn't. The coffee mug Sarah had used still sat on the kitchen counter, a lipstick mark on the rim the only proof she'd been real, that the last few hours hadn't been some elaborate hallucination brought on by isolation and age. Frank picked up the mug, holding it carefully as if it might shatter, and realized he was crying. Not the quiet tears of an old man's regret, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone watching their world end. He'd spent 50 years preparing for this moment, without knowing what he was preparing for, and now that it had arrived, he felt completely unprepared for the aftermath. The basement called to him with its familiar promise of organized research and documented certainty. Frank descended the stairs slowly, each step echoing in the silence like a countdown. His study looked smaller somehow, the walls lined with evidence of encounters that had led inexorably to this night. 50 years of careful observation, and he'd missed the most fundamental truth. None of it had ever been about him. He sat at his desk and opened the newest notebook, the one he'd started when Sarah arrived. His handwriting looked shaky in the lamplight, the words of someone trying to make sense of the impossible. Frank picked up his pen and began to write, not because he expected anyone to ever read it, but because documentation was what he did. It was who he was. Day 18,263 since first contact. Sarah has entered the deep forest with the Guardian. I understand now that everything I recorded, every observation I made, was preparation for this moment. I was never the keeper. I was the keeper's father, maintaining the connection until the true inheritor could accept her responsibility. I don't know if she'll come back. I don't know if the person who returns will still be my daughter in any meaningful sense. The Guardian spoke of change, of becoming everything she must be. I suspect I've said goodbye to the Sarah I knew, regardless of whether she survives what lies ahead. Frank paused, pen hovering over paper, trying to find words for the fear that had settled in his chest like ice. Not fear for his daughter's safety, though that terror was real and constant, but fear of success. If Sarah returned changed, if she accepted the full weight of whatever agreements their bloodline was meant to uphold, what did that mean for the world? For humanity's future? The Guardian had spoken of others of his kind who viewed human civilization as an infection to be cleansed. Sarah was walking into the forest to learn how to stand between those forces and the species they considered a threat. She was accepting responsibility for the survival of everyone Frank had ever known, everyone who would ever be born. He looked around his basement study, at the evidence of a lifetime spent documenting the impossible, and felt the full weight of his inadequacy. He'd been a caretaker, nothing more, a placeholder maintaining a connection he'd never fully understood until tonight. But perhaps that had been enough. Perhaps 50 years of faithful observation, of treating the Guardian with respect rather than fear, had preserved something essential. Perhaps his willingness to believe, to accept, to document rather than dismiss had kept the door open for this moment when everything would be decided. Frank wrote until his hand cramped and his eyes burned with exhaustion. Outside, the forest remained silent, holding its secrets close. Dawn was still hours away, and Sarah was somewhere in the darkness, learning truths that would either save the world or reveal why it couldn't be saved. All he could do now was wait, and trust that the daughter he'd raised, stubborn, brilliant, fearless Sarah, would find a way to bridge the gap between human ambition and ancient wisdom. The alternative was too terrible to consider, so Frank chose faith instead. The house settled around him, creaking with age and memory, as the longest night of his life continued its slow passage toward an uncertain dawn. The return. Frank woke to the sound of footsteps on his front porch, though he couldn't remember falling asleep at his desk. Grey dawn light filtered through the basement windows, and his neck ached from sleeping hunched over his notebook. The pen had fallen from his fingers, leaving a small ink stain on the page where he'd documented the longest night of his life. The footsteps moved slowly, deliberately, not quite matching the rhythm he remembered of Sarah's confident stride. Frank's heart hammered as he climbed the stairs, each creak of the old wood echoing his uncertainty. The person on his porch could be his daughter, or it could be something wearing his daughter's form, changed beyond recognition by whatever dwelt in the deep forest. He paused at the kitchen door, hand trembling on the knob. Through the window, he could see a figure silhouetted against the morning mist, human-shaped, familiar height, wearing Sarah's jacket. But something in the posture was different, a stillness that hadn't been there before, a way of holding herself that suggested she was listening to sounds Frank couldn't hear. "Dad?" The voice was Sarah's, but layered with something new. Not the creature's otherworldly resonance, but a depth that hadn't existed 12 hours ago. "It's me. I'm back." Frank opened the door and felt his breath catch. It was Sarah, unmistakably his daughter, but transformed in ways both subtle and profound. Her eyes held depths they hadn't possessed before, flecked now with amber that caught the morning light like the Guardian's had. Her skin seemed to glow with inner warmth, and when she moved, it was with a fluid grace that reminded him uncomfortably of the creature's predatory elegance. "Sarah?" He searched her face for the woman who'd arrived yesterday, finding echoes but not quite the same person. She smiled, and for a moment she was purely his daughter again, tired, relieved, carrying the weight of experience but fundamentally unchanged. "I know how I must look, how I must feel different to you, but I'm still me, Dad, just more than I was." Frank stepped aside to let her enter, watching as she moved through his kitchen with new awareness. Her head turned slightly at sounds too faint for him to detect, and her fingers traced the air as if following invisible currents. She was reading the space around her in ways human senses couldn't access. "Tell me," he said, settling across from her at the kitchen table where this had all began. "Tell me what happened." Sarah's new eyes focused on him with an intensity that made him shiver. "I learned why you could never leave this place, why our family has been bound to these woods for generations we never knew about." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "The Guardian took me to the heart of their territory. There are others, Dad, so many others, all held in check by agreements made when humanity was young and vulnerable." Frank saw pain flicker across her features. Not physical pain, but the ache of bearing knowledge too vast for easy comprehension. "They're not evil," Sarah continued. "But they remember when humans were just another prey species, before we learned to make tools and fire and cities. Some of them believe our expansion has gone too far, that we're destroying everything that matters. The Guardian and his allies have spent centuries holding back those who would solve the problem by eliminating us entirely. And now? Now the balance is failing. Human expansion has reached the point where even the patient ones are losing hope for coexistence." Sarah reached across the table and took his hands, and Frank felt warmth flowing from her touch that seemed to ease aches he'd carried for decades. "But there's still a chance. The old agreements can be renewed, adapted for a world our ancestors never imagined. That's what I am now, a bridge between what we were and what we might become." Frank studied his daughter's transformed features, seeing the child he'd raised beneath the weight of ancient responsibility she now carried. "What does that mean for you? For us? It means I can't go back to Chicago. Can't pretend the corporate world matters when I'm responsible for preventing a war most humans don't even know is possible." Sarah's smile held both sorrow and acceptance. "But it also means you don't have to carry this burden alone anymore. I understand now what you've been doing all these years, maintaining the connection when everyone else forgot." Frank felt tears starting again, but these were different from the night's desperate grief. "I thought I'd lost you." "You did, in a way." Sarah squeezed his hands gently. "The person who walked into that forest isn't the same one who came back, but you also found me, Dad. For the first time in my life, I know exactly why I exist, what I'm meant to do." Outside, the morning mist was lifting, revealing the familiar forest that had been Frank's world for 50 years. But now he saw it through new understanding. Not just wilderness, but a carefully maintained border between two worlds learning to coexist. His daughter had returned transformed, carrying the weight of humanity's future in her amber-flecked eyes. The price had been everything she was, just as the Guardian had warned. But what she'd become might be exactly what the world needed. Frank helped Sarah carry her bags from the rental car, though she moved with such fluid grace now that she hardly seemed to need assistance. 3 months had passed since that transformative night, and he was still adjusting to the reality of his daughter's presence. Not visiting, but living here permanently, building a life that bridged two worlds in ways he was only beginning to understand. The house felt different with her in it. Not just the obvious changes, her laptop on the kitchen table, running statistical analyses he couldn't comprehend, the strange plants she cultivated in the spare bedroom that seemed to thrive without sunlight, the low conversations she held in the evenings with visitors who approached through the forest rather than the driveway. It was something deeper, a sense of purpose that had settled into the old walls like warmth seeping into cold stone. "The Johansson family wants to sell their land to developers," Sarah said, setting down a box of what looked like legal documents. Her work now involved things Frank had never imagined: land conservation through methods that skirted the edges of human law, negotiations conducted in clearings under the full moon, contracts written in languages that predated written history. "I'll need to speak with them tomorrow." Frank nodded, though he still didn't fully understand how she managed such things. Sarah had explained that her transformation hadn't just changed her physically. It had given her access to resources, allies, and influence that operated outside normal human channels. She could persuade people to preserve wild spaces, could guide development away from sensitive areas, could make problems disappear through methods that left no paper trail anyone would ever think to follow. "Will they listen?" he asked. Sarah's amber-flecked eyes caught the afternoon light streaming through the window. "They will. People find it hard to argue with me now, especially when I'm asking them to do something that serves the greater good." Her smile was rueful. "It's not manipulation exactly. More like helping them see consequences they wouldn't have considered otherwise." In the evenings, Frank had grown accustomed to Sarah's other work. She would disappear into the forest for hours, returning with reports of meetings he could barely imagine. The Guardian was only one of many allies she now coordinated with. There were others of his kind scattered across the continent, ancient beings who had watched human civilization grow with increasing concern. Sarah had become their liaison, their interpreter, their hope for finding solutions that didn't require catastrophe. The phone rang, and Sarah answered with the crisp professionalism that remained from her corporate days. Frank listened to her side of the conversation, something about water rights and environmental impact studies, and marveled at how seamlessly she moved between worlds. To the caller, she was probably just another environmental lawyer with unusual expertise. They had no idea they were speaking with something unprecedented in human history. "The mining company backed down," she said, hanging up. Apparently their geological surveys started showing complications that made the project unviable. Frank had learned not to ask too many questions about such complications. Sarah's work operated on principles he couldn't fully grasp, drawing on alliances that had existed since before recorded history. Results mattered more than methods, and the results were undeniable. Development slowing in critical areas, conservation efforts succeeding against impossible odds, a gradually expanding network of protected spaces that formed corridors between ancient territories. As sunset approached, Frank watched his daughter prepare for her evening rounds. She moved through the house gathering items that seemed mundane: a thermos of tea, a heavy flashlight, notebooks that looked ordinary but contained writing in scripts he'd never seen before. The domesticity of it struck him as both comforting and surreal. "Will you be back tonight?" he asked, though he knew the answer might depend on negotiations beyond his understanding. "Before midnight," Sarah promised, kissing his forehead with lips that were warm as summer stone. "The Council of Elders wants to discuss the Northern Territories. Apparently there's been some success with the pilot programs." She paused at the door, silhouetted against the deepening forest exactly as she had been that night 3 months ago. But this time, Frank felt no fear, only profound gratitude. His daughter had found her purpose, and in doing so, she had given his own life meaning he'd never imagined possible. "I'm proud of you," he said, words that carried the weight of 50 years of questions finally answered. Sarah's smile was radiant, fully human despite the otherworldly grace that now defined her movement. "I'm proud of us, Dad. We did something important here. We kept the door open when everyone else had forgotten it existed." She disappeared into the darkness, and Frank settled into his chair by the window to wait for her return. Outside, the forest hummed with activity invisible to ordinary human senses. Ancient alliances strengthening, new agreements taking shape, two species learning to share a world neither could survive without the other. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in decades, Frank believed it might be bright.